MJ on the journey back to Silicon Valley. Welcome to part 2 of the React from Scratch tutorial. So we've touched up briefly on this in the last part, but we're going to be going over functional components. We mainly have seen class-based components, so we're going to dive into functional components. We're going to go into React Lifecycle and see the different cycles that a React component goes through. And then we will look at React events. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So let's go back to our app.js. And the first thing we're going to do, we're going to convert this component to a functional component. Okay, so to do that, let's just go ahead and delete it here, and then we're gonna drop a snippet of code here. Actually, let's just build it from scratch. Okay, we need to get rid of this counter. We're not gonna use it anymore. And also we can get rid of component here. And to write a functional component, just like it says it in the world, it is actually a function. So we just do function app. And we don't have to use a render method like we do in class-based components. So here we can simply just have a return statement. And that return statement can be a div. And in here, we're just going to put this is a functional component. And let's go ahead and save. And here it is, guys. So we can see our functional component on the screen. So as you can see, a functional component is basically a JavaScript function. You don't have to extend component or do anything like that. You just write it as you would write a JavaScript function. And as you can notice here, we're not calling the function, for example. We're not going down here and doing this. You don't need to do that because you already have the React setup. The other thing to notice here is it's capitalized. And the convention for all React components is for it to be capitalized. Actually, it has to be like this, not only convention. You have to capitalize, or otherwise it's just going to be looked at as really just a pure JavaScript function. When you put a capital letter, it tells React that it is actually a component. Okay, so functional components are much simpler than class-based components. The next thing we want to do in this app, by the way, guys, what we're going to do here, we're going to render our dev profile. The dev profile that we've built using class-based components in the beginning. So here we're going to render our dev profile. And then here we're going to go ahead and import it. Dev, and we already have it. Profile. Okay, we're going to import it here. And next, we want to set up our state the way we set it up with the class-based component. If we go into dev profile here, we can see that at the moment, our dev profile is getting all of its values from the props. We want it to get its value from the state. And more precisely, what I mean by that, we're going to set up state in our app.js. But since we are using functional components, we set up state in a different way using what is called React hooks. And React hooks enables us to declare two variables. One is state and set state. You can call it anything you want, but basically we have one variable that has the current state, another variable that's able to manipulate state. And that's how we set up state with React hooks. React hooks has come out with React 16, so it's fairly recent, and it's a much easier way to set up and track state within our components. So we're going to take a look at that next. React hooks are, more precisely, they let you use state and other React features without having to write a class. Now, since the birth of React and throughout its time until hooks were introduced, you always had to write a class-based component in order to use state or manipulate it. Now that is no longer the case. All you need is a functional component, and you can set state and manipulate it through using hooks. So let's get back into our code, and here we're going to import use state, and in here we're going to define a const that's going to have state and set state. And this is going to be equal to use state. And then in here is where we would define our state, the current state of affairs at this particular moment. Just like with using a constructor, we will create an object here, and that's going to be the starting point of our state. So in here, we want to define all that information that we're going to pass to our dev profile component. So in here, we're going to drop all the information related to the dev profile landing page. And that's going to be the starting point of our state. So in here we have our profile, name, description, about, and stack. And then in here we're going to pass a prop called state. And we're simply going to give it the state object that we have right here. We're just going to pass that down. And this is JavaScript deconstructor. I'm not sure you're familiar with it, but you can just pass the entire object here. And then we will go to our dev profile component. And then in here, we're going to simply, well, the first thing we need to do, we need to convert dev profile to a class-based component. Because at the moment, convert it, to a functional-based component. Because at the moment, it is a class-based component, and we cannot use React hooks in class-based components. So we're gonna convert the dev profile to a functional component. All right, the first thing we're gonna do, we're gonna get rid of the render method here, and then get rid of the bracket here. And then instead of saying class dev profile extends component, we're gonna simply say function dev profile and parentheses, and that is it. We've just turned it into a functional component. And now we're gonna take in our state that comes from the parent component as props through deconstructoring. So in here, we're simply gonna pass state. And that will pass the entire object that's coming in from the parent component. Now within the dev profile component, instead of saying this dot props, we're simply going to replace it with state. And we're going to do the same thing for the name, the same thing for the description, And the same thing for about and the stack. And now if we save, we should see our application not breaking, hopefully. And here it is, guys. So it is working. We have our landing page that renders, and all the values are dynamically pulled from the React hooks. It's all being pulled from state. So that's how you write a functional component, and that's how you set up state in it using React hooks. And I'm sure that by now you've noticed that it's a much easier setup than having to use a class-based component. Now, we will always look at kind of both examples, class-based components and functional-based components, because as you are on the job or working on React applications, you're gonna come across both class-based and functional-based, and you need to be familiar with both. But right now, a lot of people have just moved to only writing functional components. So you will see a lot more functional components going forward. Let's go ahead and look at our counter example. So in app.js, let's get rid of this particular hook here and get rid of the dev profile. And instead, we're gonna just render counter again. Right? And in here, we're gonna import it. And we're gonna go into counter.js. First, we will convert it from a class-based component to a functional-based component. And the first thing we want to do is get rid of the render method. And then let's get rid of the component. Instead of the component, we're gonna import use state. And instead of saying class counter extends component, we will simply say function counter parentheses. And I think that's it. We've converted it to a functional based component. Now we need to convert our state here using hooks. So since we're using a counter, we're gonna go const state and then set state, and this will be equal to use state, and then the initial starting point of our state is 0 because it's the counter, right? And now down here, instead of saying this dot state, we don't need the this keyword because we're not using a class-based component. We should simply say state. And then in here, we don't need any function binding. We just put the name of the function and then it would run once the button is clicked. And now if we save both of these, we should see our counter and it should be working. Let's pull up our application. And everything has failed to compile. Okay, so increase counter is not defined. Okay, so our functions are not defined. Okay, let's take a look at this. So the functions are not defined. Here we'll do counter. Okay. Ah, there it is. What's going on here is that we also should take out this here. We don't need to use this because we already have this function here that's responsible for setting our state. We don't need a this tied to it. And now if we save, they're still not defined. Oh, here. Need to get rid of this and get rid of it here. Let's save. They're still not defined. Okay, let me debug this, guys. Be right back. Okay, guys, so what is going on here is that, okay, in class-based components, if we write a function like this, it will work. But in functional-based components, we need to actually define it because it's not defined now. If you write it like this in class-based components, it will be defined, it would run. In functional-based components, you need to actually define it the way you would define a JavaScript function. And now if we add both these functions, now they should be defined. Let's go ahead and save. Oh, these are arrow functions. Okay, no, instead of doing the function, let's do it the ES6 way. Let's put a const here, and then also a const over here, so that we can keep our use of arrow functions. If you don't want to use arrow functions, just turn the whole thing to a just function increase counter parentheses, just like the function counter is over here. Okay, and now if we save, it should work. And it does. We have our counter app rendering again. Now, what's interesting here, we're seeing the state is not showing up. It's giving us a none, which is a JavaScript function for not a number. Why is that? Okay, let's see. State.counter. Okay. No, we don't need to put state.counter here anymore. We simply can just write state. And then if we save, that is weird. Okay, maybe that's a mistake there. Let's bring this back. Okay, const. Okay. Okay, so it's not rendering our state. Use state 0. Oh yeah, we don't need the dot counter here. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so it's showing our state. That was just acting buggy there. Okay, so we have our state. Let's see. Okay, when we click, something funny happens. Let's go ahead and inspect. Objects are not valid as React. Use an array instead. Let me look at this further again. What's going on? Okay, the first thing, we need to get rid of this dot counter here. Okay? We just need state. The other thing that's going on is telling us here objects are not valid as a React child if you meant to render a collection of children, use an array instead. Because here we're doing a set state and then we're passing an object, which is completely wrong. That's the way to do. You do this in class-based components, and not only that, we're passing in an object while our initial state is a number. It's not an object. Okay, so we just need to get rid of this whole thing in here, and then simply put state plus 1. And then in the decrease, we can just put state minus 1. And now if we save, it should work. Okay, we're not showing any errors. Let's go ahead, let's open it up, let's press the button. And it works. It increases and also decreases our counter. So that's how you set up React hooks, guys. So now we've looked at also the counter example, which is a number example. It's different than the static one with the dev profile component. So that's how you do it. You initialize a const that has the current state and then a function that's able to manipulate that state. And then in your functions, you use your set state, and then you would just render either the state or the functions you've defined. Okay? We're going to check out the life cycles that a React component goes through. We're going to look at an example where we render a clock dynamically. So let's get that set up. Let's create the clock component and render it, and then we'll talk about lifecycle methods. Let's jump back into our app.js, and here instead of rendering the counter, we're going to render a clock. And then let's go ahead and create. Now we can create this component in a separate file, but for the practicality of the tutorial, we're just going to go ahead and create it here. But you can create it in a separate file and simply import it here the way you've imported counter. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to grab a snippet of code. I already have it here in Sandbox. Let's grab it over here. Okay, so it's gonna be a class-based component. We're gonna always be looking at that first, and then we've seen earlier how to convert it to a functional component. Let's go ahead and drop this here and talk about it a bit. So it's a React component. It extends component, just like how we've seen the way you do class-based components. We have a constructor that calls props, and then we call super props here, and here we set the state. We're setting the state to a new date. This is a JavaScript method. It's built in, and it gives you the date right now of whatever day you're using it in. And then here we are rendering the state of the clock. Okay? Now, and then here we are rendering clock. Okay, so I think we're ready to go. So let's go ahead and save. A little bit of cleanup here. We're going to get rid of the import counter because we no longer need it. And we're going to get rid of use state because we're using a class-based component. So we're not going to be using React hooks. And let's just, instead of use state, let's import component because we're going to need it. These are class-based components. Let's see. Let's go ahead and save. Oh yeah, okay, it is working. However, I've added some CSS, guys, to make this look a little bit better. So I'm going to add it here. Okay, let's go here. And let's go into our app.css. And then I'm just going to drop some CSS here. Okay, great. So looking better. Okay, so we have a clock component that is rendering to the screen. Now, currently this particular component is it's not updating the time dynamically. So what we want to do ideally, since this is a clock, we want it to keep updating the time, and we're going to add that dynamically. Okay, all right, so the next thing we're going to do, set up two functions. One is called component did mount, another one is component will unmount. And these are two lifecycle methods. So in React applications that have many components, it's very important to free up resources taken by the components when they are destroyed. So we want to set up a timer where whenever the clock is rendered to the screen for the first time, it's called mounting. So the component did mount. And in the component did mount, it would be a good place to set up our timer. So when the component mounts, then we set up the counter. So in here, we're gonna put our lifecycle method, and it's gonna be called component did mount. And since this is a lifecycle method, you're just gonna call it like this. You don't have to write function. We're in a class-based component, and these are just lifecycle methods. So you just write component did mount, and then in here, we want to set up a timer. When the component renders on the screen for the first time, we want to set up our timer here. And the way we're going to do that, I'm going to drop this snippet of code and then explain it. Okay, so in here, we're setting up a timer ID. And that timer ID, this is a JavaScript function set interval. So every 1,000 milliseconds, it will run this function here, tick. Okay? So that's what will allow the clock to keep ticking and actually give us the correct time. Okay? Now, the next thing we want to do is, okay, we're going to go ahead and also set up our component will unmount. And this method runs when the component unmounts from the DOM. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just pick up this snippet of code here. Okay, so what this says clear interval, this timer ID. So once the component is done doing what it needs to do, it's gonna clear it out. Okay? Next. All right, we're gonna set up our tick function. Okay, let me go ahead and grab the snippet of code here. Okay, so this particular function, it sets the state to a new date. Okay? And now, if we go ahead and save this, now we can see that our clock is actually ticking. So that's how you set up lifecycle methods in React. So the state here sets up a new date. And that's what happens the first time that the clock component renders to the screen. So boom, it sets up the new date. And then in the component did mount, we set up an interval for every 1,000 milliseconds. We will set the state to the new date. Okay, so every 1,000 milliseconds we will update the state, and that's how you update the state dynamically. And then once it's updated, component will unmount, will take care of actually clearing that interval, the timer ID that we have. This is really important in React because it's management of resources. You have a lot of components going through their life cycles. You want to make sure that you clear out any values that are no longer needed. So that's how you set up lifecycle methods in React. Guys, something important to keep in mind, when you're building React applications, it's really a case-by-case scenario. It's going to be up to you to determine what logic to put in what lifecycle method. So you need to think about it, okay, when your app first fires up, what is the information that you need right away when things render to the screen? And whatever the information that is that you need right away, probably the component did mount is a good place to set that up, because it's right after everything just shows up in the screen. Now, there are other lifecycle methods. We're not going to go through them now because these are the main ones. The component mounts, the component unmounts. That's basically the concept. Now, in the middle of that, there are other lifecycle methods, but this is basically the basis you want to think about. First, when everything renders the screen, what information is needed like right away? And that goes in the component did mount. And then once the component is done doing what it's doing, it needs to get rid of whatever values it has in it, and the component will unmount is a good place to take care of that. Okay, so basically that's how you need to think about life cycle, like when the component gets born, lives, and then dies at the end. That's how you kind of want to take a look at it, and you set that up according to your app requirements. What is it that you're building? What information you need first, in the middle, and then last. That's basically how you think about lifecycle, React lifecycle. That's basically how you think about it. Now let's take a look at React events. We've already seen events throughout examples in this tutorial, but we're going to visit them with a bit of emphasis on a particular good practice. Okay, so in our app here, we're just going to get rid of the clock example. We're going to put a new example here. So just get rid of everything, and then we're going to be rendering a, let's take a look at it here. We're going to be rendering a football component. It's basically a component that asks you to take a shot, and then once you take the shot, it tells you, hey, great shot. So it's basically just an example. So the component will be football, and then I'm going to get a snippet of code here. Let's just drop it here. Now, bear in mind, you can always create a separate file for this component and import it into your app.js. Always remember that. It's just easier to do it this way because we have the component here. We can just render it down here. So here you have a class-based component. It extends React component. Let's just get rid of this here. We don't need it. And then in there, there's a shoot function here that basically just alerts great shot to the screen. And the render method returns a button with an on-click event. And the convention with React events, they're all in camel-cased letters. So the on-click would be like this. In regular HTML or JavaScript, you would just see it with a lowercase c. But the convention with React events is to use a capital letter. And basically, when we click the button, it runs this function here, shoot, which we created over here, okay? So let's go ahead and save this. and see if this works. Okay, so here it is, guys. So we have the button here. It's actually pretty small. I didn't include any CSS, but anyway, let's go ahead and click on it. And here, it alerts great shot to the screen. So this is a React event. The best practice here I want to talk about is the practice of putting the event handler as a method in the component class. So this is how you want to do this. You always write it as a method here, right above the render, and then inside the event handler you can just evoke it here. So that's how you set up React events. Just the takeaway from here is that they are all in camel case letters, and the best practice is to write them above the render method as functions and then evoke them in whatever it is that you're rendering at the moment. So that's React events in a nutshell. Okay, and yeah, now that we've done that, that concludes part 2 of the React from Scratch tutorial. Up next, we're going to be looking at React forms using CSS with React as well as Sass. I hope you really enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, hit the thumbs up on the video, subscribe to the channel for more, and please consider supporting the journey with a cup of coffee. There's a link on how to do that in the video. Until next time, I'll see you in part 3 of the React from Scratch tutorial. This is MJ on the journey back to Silicon Valley.